The tendon in the arch of her foot and the bones in her toes are broken. Like all girls at that time, she was told she'd never marry if she didn't have small feet.
Have you ever wondered how cultural beauty standards can shape and sometimes harm the lives of those who live by them? What would you be willing to do in order to be seen as more desirable to the opposite gender? In ancient China and all the way up until the mid-1900s, women with smaller feet were seen as more desirable. The practice of foot binding was a very painful, time-consuming procedure of wrapping and disfiguring the feet so that they would grow into tiny, deformed shapes known as lotus feet. For families with marriageable daughters, the size of the girl's foot translated into its own form of currency that was used to push the family into a higher standard of living, since women with smaller feet could command higher bride prices. These women were more sought after and considered more valuable to men than women with normal-sized feet. In fact, the smaller and more deformed a woman's feet were, the higher her chances were of finding a suitable husband and getting married. This part of Chinese history is one that is often overlooked, but today we'll dig deeper into the reasons for the practice and how it often left many women crippled and disfigured for the rest of their lives. Tiny feet were predominantly for the benefits of men. At the time, they found lotus feet to be an incredibly attractive feature on a woman and believed that they would perform better in the bedroom. Because of the way it crippled the body, it caused the women to walk in shorter, more controlled steps. It was generally accepted that this difficulty in walking is what caused the women to use more muscles in their inner thighs, hips, and pelvic region. Men believed that the combination of small feet and extra exertion placed on these muscles is what gave them a tighter, smaller nether region, and in turn led to a more pleasurable, intimate experience. Foot fetishes aren't unique to modern-day society because back in the day, the Chinese viewed small feet as the ultimate arousal factor. While doing the deed, many men would require their wives and concubines to leave their lotus shoes on while performing. Some were so incredibly intrigued by the deformed feet that they found different ways to increase arousal by engaging in random acts such as smelling, caressing, licking, and even putting the foot directly into their mouths. But that's not the worst of it all. Some of the stranger acts of intimacy for lotus lovers at the time included drinking the same water that the feet had been washed in, or placing food in between the toes and nibbling it out. These lotus feet were also an indication of a man's wealth and status. Throughout China's long history, there were many periods where the country was so poor they were on the brink of starvation. One could always tell which man was wealthy and better off just by looking at how many lotus-footed wives he had. Because these women couldn't work and could do very little except for stay in their homes all day, it was certainly a way of showing people how many useless mouths he was able to feed. Most of the images we see of bound feet today depict much older women, but in reality, this practice was started very early on. The younger, the better. Binding at an early age was thought to cause blood to flow up the girl's legs, entering the thighs and hips, supposedly increasing fertility. Young girls would typically start the process of wrapping their feet between the ages of 4 and 9 and would have very little to no choice in the matter. The process to obtain lotus feet was long. It took nearly 2 years and multiple rounds of binding. To begin, the feet were soaked in warm water to help soften the skin, and then vigorously scrubbed to remove any dry skin from the area. Toenails were clipped incredibly short to prevent any cuts when the binding started, and alum was sprinkled in between toes to prevent sweat and moisture buildup. Next came the actual process of applying the bandages for binding. Long bandages were soaked in water so that when they dried out, they would shrink around the feet, constricting the foot even tighter. Whoever was wrapping the feet took all 4 of the small toes and bent them inward towards the sole of the foot. A bandage was then placed around the toes to help secure them solidly in place to the bottom of the foot. More bandages were then wrapped around the entire foot, creating a tight figure 8. By doing this, the heel was brought forward, and over time, the arch of the foot became completely fractured. The process was terrible, but even more frightening is that the girls would have to undergo this procedure every few days. The bandages would have to be removed and new ones were applied to ensure that the correct bones were moving and breaking. All lotus feet were desirable in China, but some were certainly more desirable than others. There was a hierarchy between feet, based on the length of the foot after a successful binding. The lowest level was known as the iron lotus. An iron lotus foot would be of a length that was longer than 4 inches. Because length was directly related to how likely a girl was to get married, those with iron lotus feet were more likely to stay unmarried because their feet were not considered as valuable as the others. The next level of lotus feet was known as the silver lotus. Feet with this title measured roughly 4 inches in length and were more desirable than iron, but still not what was considered to be the best at the time. Women who were the most prized were those who had the infamous golden lotus. Women with this title had feet that measured a mere 3 inches long. That's roughly the size of a pack of cigarettes. Women with golden lotus feet were nearly guaranteed a marriage, as feet of this size were seen as the ultimate in arousal fantasy for men at the time. Books in ancient China even gave instructions to men on different ways to enjoy the golden lotus feet of women. Lotus feet were a hygiene nightmare. Besides the pain of having your feet wrapped tightly, there were other medical concerns surrounding the practice. First, the toenails presented their own set of complications. In some cases, the toenails would curl under the edges of the skin, causing cuts and tears. Ingrown toenails would be filled with pus and caused a horrible smell that permeated the air. In some cases, constriction of the foot became so severe that parts of the skin and foot would simply die and rot away. Some girls were even missing toes due to loss of circulation from the compression of the bandages. When the bandages were removed, the girls' toes would simply fall onto the floor. To some people, this was acceptable because less skin and fewer toes equals a smaller foot. All of these issues led to high levels of infection, including gangrene. Gangrene was rampant because of the bandages, which allowed infection to grow and fester underneath, ultimately putting the young girls in grave danger. Maybe the worst part about the hygiene of the lotus feet was that even if everything went well in youth, the girl was destined for a life of complete devotion to her feet. She would have to meticulously tend to, wash, medicate, and rebind her feet for the rest of her life. Lotus feet were a torture that lasted a lifetime. As with many trends, lotus feet eventually started falling out of fashion. The practice began to go out of style towards the end of the Qing dynasty, when China began being colonized by multiple Western nations during the mid to late 1800s. The colonists took pity on women who were suffering due to the painful feet, and Western women who had come to China even opened up shelters to help support those whose feet had been damaged by the process. During this time, Chinese intellectuals who had studied abroad in Western countries returned to China with disgusted stances on the act of foot binding. By the fall of the Qing dynasty, lotus feet were losing their hold. As time went on, these feet were viewed with more and more disgust by the same country that had thought them so desirable for so many years. By 1949, foot binding had become a distasteful act and was synonymous with feudal and backward China. And by the end of the 1950s, foot binding had been outlawed and abolished in all provinces of China. For a dwindling number of elderly women today, this practice was forced upon them at a young age. But they were unlucky enough that in their lifetime, the trend finally reached its end, making it so that the small feet these women sacrificed so much for now made them a subject of heartless public ridicule.